The terminal at O'Hare was the kind of place that made people feel small. Gate B22's attached cafe, a narrow, fluorescent bright strip called the Departure Lounge, was packed wall-to-wall with business travelers by 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, laptops open, earbuds in, the air thick with burned espresso and self-importance. Nobody noticed the young woman tucked into the corner table near the window. Eloise Darden, 28 years old, sat with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of green tea, her left hand hidden inside the sleeve of a faded olive green hoodie. She had arrived an hour early for her connecting flight back to San Diego after a 3-day family visit in Milwaukee, and she had chosen the corner table deliberately. Small, out of the way, pressed against this glass where the gray October sky pressed back. She wore no makeup. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose bun. A battered canvas tote bag sat on the chair beside her. To anyone glancing over, she looked like a grad student, or maybe a tired young mother traveling alone. Someone easy to overlook. She was neither of those things. But Eloise had learned, in the years since she came home, that invisibility was sometimes the kindest thing the world could offer. 2 years ago, Eloise had been a staff sergeant and 68W combat medic with the 101st Airborne Division on her second deployment to Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. She had been the kind of medic that other soldiers whispered about in a good way. The one who ran toward the crack of the explosion instead of away from it, who could maintain a femoral tourniquet and shout triage instructions simultaneously while taking fire. She had twice been recommended for the Army Commendation Medal. She had saved 11 lives in 2 deployments, documented. The undocumented ones she kept in a different part of her memory. 14 months ago, an IED blast on a supply route outside Forward Operating Base, Pasab had ended her active service. She had shielded a wounded soldier with her own body during a secondary detonation. The first blast had already taken 3 of her colleagues. The secondary had taken her left hand below the wrist and fractured 4 vertebrae. The man she had been shielding, a young first lieutenant, barely 22 years old, who had been asking about his dog in a voice that kept fading and coming back, had not survived the medevac flight. She never learned his name. Patient confidentiality, chain of command, the classified nature of the convoy. She only knew his face. She only knew that she had stayed beside him for 6 hours in the dark, pressing her jacket against his chest wound, talking to him quietly, promising things she couldn't guarantee. That it was going to be okay. That the bird was coming. That somebody loved him and was waiting. Now Eloise worked the intake desk at the San Diego Veterans Affairs Community Outreach Annex, processing paperwork for veterans seeking benefits. It was not the medicine she had trained for. But it kept her close to the work. It kept her tethered to something that mattered, on the days when tethering felt difficult. She was watching a plane push back from the gate when the voice arrived. "Excuse me." Sharp, the kind of sharp that was designed to cut rather than to ask. "This is a 4-person table. There are 4 of us." Eloise looked up. The man standing over her was somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He had the kind of jaw that had probably once been handsome, and now just looked set. Behind him stood 2 younger men in matching dark blazers, both holding coffee cups and pretending to look at their phones. A woman in a silk blouse was already beginning to pull out a chair. His name, she would later learn, was Spencer Kroft. He was the founder and CEO of Kroft Urban Group, a real estate development firm headquartered in Chicago. He had been featured in 3 business magazines in the past 18 months, twice with a headline about disrupting urban housing markets, and once with a headline about a lawsuit that had been quietly settled out of court. "I've got a flight," Eloise said evenly, without raising her voice. "And we have a meeting." Spencer glanced at his Rolex, then at her canvas tote bag, with the air of a man cataloging everything it said about her, and finding it insufficient. "This table seats 4. You're 1 person with a T. The math isn't complicated." "There's a table opening up near the door," Eloise said, gesturing toward it. Spencer didn't look where she gestured. "I'd rather not be near the door. We need space to work, and you clearly don't." He pulled out the chair next to her tote bag and moved the bag to the floor in a single motion. a gesture so casually dismissive it seemed almost practiced. "I'm sure you understand." The couple at the neighboring table looked away. A businessman across the aisle suddenly found his laptop screen riveting. The barista behind the counter wiped the same spot 3 times. Eloise closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She had developed this habit in the field. 1 second to feel the thing, 1 second to set it aside, and then you move. She reached for her tote. The terminal doors behind her slid open, and the sound that followed was not what anyone expected. It was the sound of a terminal going quiet. Not the loud quiet of an announcement, but the soft, spreading quiet that happens when a room collectively registers something it cannot immediately explain. Major General Ruth Caverly was 61 years old, 5'8", and built with the efficient, zero-waste posture of a woman who had been standing at attention for 4 decades. She wore her Army service uniform, the dark green jacket, with its rows of ribbons telling stories that most civilians would need a reference guide to decode. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, a combat action badge. Above her left breast pocket, the insignia of Army Special Operations Command. Her silver hair was cut close and precise. Her face was the kind of face that had been weathered into something stronger than beauty. She walked into the departure lounge flanked by a single aide, a young captain who was practically jogging to keep pace. Beside her, on a leash held loosely in her right hand, walked a German shepherd of extraordinary bearing. The dog was large and lean, his coat a deep sable and tan, his ears fully erect and swiveling independently as he processed the room. A graying muzzle told his age, 8, maybe 9, but his gait was measured and deliberate, the gait of an animal who had learned to read terrain long before this terminal existed. His vest read, "Rettered Military Working Dog. Do not pet." His name was Argos. He had served 6 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He had deployed 4 times. He had taken a bullet in Helmand Province, protecting his handler. The Army had retired him 2 years ago, and General Caverly, whose late son had been Argos's handler, had brought him home. The terminal crowd parted around the general the way water parts around a stone. A man in a pilot's uniform straightened involuntarily. A gate agent touched the back of her own hair. Spencer Kroft, who had been mid-sentence about Q3 projections, fell silent and turned. General Caverly did not look at Spencer Kroft. She did not look at the airline executive 3 tables over who was already half rising from his chair in anticipation of being acknowledged. She did not look at the city alderman near the charging station, who had recognized her and was fumbling for a business card. Her eyes, pale gray and extremely still, moved directly to the corner table. To Eloise Darden. The general took in the faded hoodie, the paper cup of tea, the left sleeve that hung slightly differently from the right, her jaw tightened by a fraction, something that, to an outside observer, might have looked like nothing at all. She walked to the corner table. Spencer Kroft's mouth opened. "General Caverly, ma'am. Spencer Kroft, Kroft Urban Group. It's an honor. If you need this table." General Caverly looked at him for 1 full second. The second had the quality of something that could be pressed like a coin and kept. Then she looked back at Eloise and pulled out the chair across from her. "Do you mind if I sit here?" she asked. Her voice was low, composed, and did not carry the room the way Spencer Kroft's had. It was the voice of a woman who had given orders in firefights and did not need volume to be obeyed. Eloise blinked. "Of course, General." She pulled her tote from the floor. Spencer had already released the chair beside it and straightened in her seat. The general sat. She held Argos's leash loosely as the dog settled into a disciplined sit at her left side, facing out toward the room. His gaze swept the cafe with the patient, systematic attention of an animal cataloging every possible variable. Then Argos stopped sweeping. His nose came up slowly, the way a compass needle finds north. He was looking at Eloise. General Caverly noticed immediately. Her hand tightened on the leash. "Argos, fuss. The German command for heel, stay put." Argos was a dual-language working dog, trained in German commands to prevent field interception. Argos did not comply. It was the first time in 2 years that he had not complied with a direct command. The dog rose from his sit position with a deliberateness that made several nearby people inhale sharply. He took 3 measured steps toward Eloise's side of the table. His ears, which had been fully erect and tactical, slowly lowered. Not in submission, but in something more complex. Something the people watching from adjacent tables would not have a word for, but would remember for years. A soft sound came from the dog's chest. Not a growl, not a bark, a sound that was almost human in its quality. A sound of recognition. Argos lowered his large head and placed his muzzle very gently against Eloise's left forearm. The arm with the prosthetic hand, the arm she always kept covered. Eloise went completely still. "He doesn't do that," General Caverly said quietly. Something had slipped loose in her voice. "He hasn't let anyone but me touch him since." She stopped. Argos pressed closer to Eloise's arm. The dog's eyes, deep amber, ringed with gray at the edges, looked up at her face. He made the sound again, lower now, almost private. Eloise's right hand moved before she could think about it. Her fingers found the fur behind the dog's ear. That particular spot, the spot she had once been told all working dogs secretly loved. Told by a young lieutenant who had laughed about it in the dark, told her the dog's name, and said he worried about who would take care of him if... She heard her own breath change. "General," she said, and her voice came out almost level. "What was this dog's previous handler's name?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the terminal. General Caverly did not answer immediately. She reached into the breast pocket of her uniform jacket. Her movements were controlled, but her hands that had signed deployment orders, hands that had once folded a flag, were not entirely steady. She placed a photograph on the table between them. It was a 4x6 print, slightly worn at the corners. A young man in army combat uniform, kneeling in the dust somewhere, that looked like it could have been anywhere in that part of the world, his arm around a German shepherd puppy, who was already nearly as large as he was. The young man was laughing. He had his mother's gray eyes. In the bottom corner, a date handwritten in pen. The same date that Eloise Darden kept in the locked drawer of the part of her memory she rarely opened. "His name was First Lieutenant Noah Caverly," the general said. "He was my son." The paper cup of tea fell sideways on the table. Neither of them moved to write it. "He was convoy patrol," Eloise whispered. The sounds of the terminal went very far away. "B route outside Passab. Secondary IED. He had a chest wound, hemothorax. I was applying a seal when the second device." She stopped. Her throat had closed. He kept asking about his dog. He kept asking if the dog was okay. General Ruth Caverly pressed her hand flat against the table, steadying herself. A single tear ran along the line of her jaw, and she made no move to conceal it, or to explain it to the crowd of strangers, now watching with the held breath. Attention of people who understand they are witnessing something they did not earn the right to see, but cannot turn away from. The after-action report was classified, the general said. His convoy carried sensitive materiel, everything connected to it. The incident report, the first responder records, was sealed by JAG. I knew a medic had stayed with him. The field surgeon at Passab told me afterward that Noah's vitals had been maintained for nearly 6 hours by a combat medic who had sustained her own injuries in the secondary blast and refused to leave his side. She looked at Eloise's left arm. I spent 14 months trying to find that medic through official channels, privacy regulations, redactions. I hit a wall at every turn. Eloise felt Argos's weight settle against her leg, a steady, anchoring pressure. "I didn't know his name," Eloise said. "They never told me his name. She stopped again. He was so brave. He was so steady. He was worried about the dog the whole time. He loved that dog more than he loved anything except the mission." General Caverly's voice was very quiet. "When Argos came home, when I took him, he was inconsolable for 3 months. He wouldn't eat. He'd sit by the door. Then slowly he started to come back." She looked at the dog, who had not moved from Eloise's side. "I have never seen him do what he just did. Not once. In 2 years." Argos lifted his head and licked the inside of Eloise's wrist, the seam where the prosthetic joined her remaining tissue. Once, carefully, and then rested his chin on her knee. Eloise stopped fighting what was happening behind her eyes. They sat like that for a while, the general and the medic and the dog, in the middle of the loudest airport in the Midwest, inside a quiet that belonged entirely to them. Spencer Kroft had retreated to the table by the door. He sat with his associates, saying nothing, his meeting notes untouched. He was a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He had never in his adult life felt so completely erased by the presence of someone who was not even looking at him. Eloise wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a slow breath. "There's something you should know," she said. Before, she looked at her hands. "You said you found out why you couldn't locate me?" A retired federal magistrate, Judge Patricia Holden, helped me unseal the first responder log 6 days ago. Your name was at the top. General Caverly's gaze was level and direct. "I was already in Chicago for a DO'd briefing when I found it. I pulled your service record, your discharge, your current employer." A pause. "I know where you work, Sergeant Darden." Eloise straightened slightly, the instinct to attention still alive in her spine, even in a hoodie and civilian shoes. "Then you know it isn't much. I process VA paperwork." "I know." The general's voice held no judgment, "and I know that as of this Friday that office may cease to exist." Eloise's expression didn't change. She had known this was coming for months. The San Diego VA Community Outreach Annex occupied a building on a corner lot in Chula Vista that Kroft Urban Group had been pursuing for 18 months. The rezoning vote was today. Spencer Kroft had lobbied the city council with projections showing the annex served a fractional demographic and that a mixed-use luxury tower on the site would generate 4 times the property tax revenue. He had the votes, according to the Veteran Service Organization that had sent Eloise an email last week with the subject line, "We tried." "He's been trying to tear it down," Eloise said. 32 staff report there every morning. 640 veterans in that zip code process their disability claims, their housing assistance, their medical referrals through that office. She looked at her hands again. "I don't have the resources to fight a man like that." The union submitted comments. The VSO filed an objection. It didn't matter. "It will matter now," General Caverly said. She took out her phone. What followed happened quickly, with the clean, decisive momentum of a command decision made by someone who had not lived 61 years and risen to 2 stars by hesitating. 3 calls in 6 minutes. Eloise heard fragments. Federal Land Covenant, 1956, permanent use restriction on DOD transferred property. And then a judge's name, and then the name of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and then silence while someone on the other end apparently spoke at length, and then, "Yes, sir, I'll be there within the hour." The Chula Vista City Council was holding its rezoning session at 10 a.m. It was now 8:40. General Caverly came back to the table. She looked at Eloise with an expression that contained in equal measure grief, purpose, and something that might, in a different moment, have been called relief. "I need you to come with me," she said. "My aide has a car." "I have a flight." "You can rebook the flight." The general glanced toward Spencer Kroft's table with the focused, assessing quality of attention she might have given a strategic obstacle. "There is also the matter of Mr. Kroft, who, if I am correct about the federal land covenant on that property, may find his afternoon significantly less comfortable than he is expecting." Spencer Kroft was watching them now, his coffee cold and forgotten in front of him. The Chula Vista City Council chambers were a modest room in a municipal building that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. 9 council members sat behind a curved dais. A city attorney in a gray suit was already spreading documents across the table when the chamber doors opened and 3 people walked in. Spencer Kroft was at the front of the room, mid-presentation, gesturing at an architectural rendering on a projection screen. A gleaming residential tower where a squat, institutional building currently stood. He had recovered his composure on the drive south, had called his lawyers twice, and arrived looking like a man who intended to finish what he had started. He turned when the doors opened. Major General Ruth Caverly walked in first, full dress uniform, every medal in its place, her aide at her shoulder with a leather portfolio. Argos moved at her left side, his gait soundless on the industrial carpet. and at the general's right, in her olive hoodie and worn canvas tote, was Eloise Darden. "I have an objection," said General Caverly, and the room rearranged itself around the fact of her voice. The council president, a woman named Donna Archibald, set down her pen. "General Caverly, this is an open session, but the agenda. The agenda includes a vote to rezone federal property," General Caverly said, taking her position at the end of the council table, opposite Spencer Kroft. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. The parcel on which the VA Community Outreach Annex stands was transferred to Chula Vista by the Department of Defense in 1956 under a permanent use covenant, stipulating veteran health care services in perpetuity. Mr. Kroft's attorneys advised you that covenant had lapsed. She looked at Kroft directly. "It has not lapsed." The original deed language was unambiguous. Federal covenants of this type require an act of Congress to dissolve. Spencer Kroft's jaw was doing something controlled and unsuccessful. "General, with respect, this is a matter of municipal zoning law, and the council we retained. The council you retained billed you $400,000 to advise you incorrectly, Mr. Kroft. That is a problem for you and your council to resolve." "It is not a problem for this council." General Caverly's aide stepped forward and placed a thick document package on the dais. "Those are emergency injunctions issued this morning by Federal District Judge Patricia Holden, freezing all rezoning proceedings on that parcel indefinitely. The Department of Veterans Affairs is simultaneously opening an inquiry into whether Kroft Urban Group's procurement of its site assessment constituted attempted federal land fraud." The color went out of Spencer Kroft's face in stages, like a sunset happening in reverse. One of his associates put a hand on his arm. He shook it off. "This is a personal vendetta," he said, his voice thinning. "This is a military officer abusing her position over a desk clerk." General Caverly walked down the length of the room until she was standing directly in front of Spencer Kroft. Argos followed, and the dog's presence, the quiet mass of him, the amber eyes level and unblinking, had a physical effect on the atmosphere that no one in that room could have explained in writing, but everyone felt in their chest. "That desk clerk," General Caverly said, her voice dropping into a register that Eloise recognized from the field. The register used when something needed to be said only once and heard forever. "Is a decorated United States Army combat medic who sustained a traumatic amputation while shielding a wounded ranger officer with her body under active fire. She maintained his vital signs with her bare hands for 6 hours in the dark in enemy territory until evacuation arrived. She gave her left hand, trying to bring my son home to me." She took one step closer to Kroft. Argos did not step closer, but something shifted in his posture that made Spencer Kroft take one step back. "You will not address her as anything less than what she is, and you will want to think very carefully before you speak again in this room." Spencer Kroft picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He said nothing. He walked out of the chamber ahead of his associates, leaving the architectural rendering still glowing on the projector screen. A tower that would never be built, casting cold blue light onto a room that had gone very, very quiet. General Caverly turned back to the council. The controlled fury that had been in her face dissolved into something businesslike, forward-facing, the countenance of a woman already thinking past the next hill. "The VA annex will remain," she told them. "Beyond that, I have been in contact with the Assistant Secretary of Veterans Affairs and 2 private defense contractors who have pledged matching federal funds. We intend to expand the annex into a comprehensive trauma rehabilitation and canine-assisted recovery center, the first of its kind on the West Coast. The federal funding commitment was confirmed this morning." Donna Archibald looked at the injunction documents. She looked at General Caverly. She looked at the door through which Spencer Kroft had disappeared. "The rezoning motion is tabled," she said quietly. "Indefinitely." In the back of the chamber, Eloise Darden sat in a folding chair with Argos's head resting in her lap and her right hand moving slowly through the fur at his neck, and she did not trust herself to speak. So she said nothing, and in that room, with that dog, it was more than enough. General Caverly came to her afterward. After the chamber had emptied, after the aide had stepped outside to field calls, after the projector had been shut off, and the rendering of the luxury tower had blinked away into darkness. She sat in the folding chair beside Eloise, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "The center will need a director of medical operations," the general said finally. "Someone who understands trauma medicine at the field level. Someone who understands what it means to come home and still have to fight just to stand still." She paused. "Someone those veterans will look at and understand, without a word of explanation, that she knows what they carried and chose to keep going anyway." Eloise looked down at Argos. The dog looked back with the unhurried gravity that only very old soldiers and very old dogs learn to inhabit. "I haven't practiced clinical medicine in over a year, General. I'm a one-handed intake coordinator." "You maintained a tension pneumothorax seal in the dark under mortar fire, Sergeant Darden. I've read your complete service record 3 times in the past 6 days. Don't tell me what you can't do." Eloise was quiet for a long moment. "What would you name it?" she asked. "The center." General Caverly was quiet too, for a moment that held a great deal inside it. "The Noah Caverly Veterans Recovery Center," she said, "if that is acceptable to you." Eloise nodded. She did not try to speak. As for Argos, General Caverly unclipped the leash from the dog's harness and placed it in Eloise's lap with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has been deciding to do a thing for much longer than the moment makes visible. "He is retired from service. He has been looking for something I couldn't give him. I think you understand what that is better than I can put into words." She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket. "He found it about 45 minutes ago in a coffee shop at O'Hare. I think we should both respect that." Eloise looked at the leash in her lap, at Argos, who had not moved, whose amber eyes were entirely calm and entirely certain, the way the eyes of creatures become when they have been lost a long time and are not lost anymore. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steady. "I'll accept the position." "Good," General Caverly said, and for the first time that day she smiled. Not the smile of a commanding officer, but the smaller, more difficult smile of a mother who has found a way to keep carrying something. "He is an absolute terror about his breakfast schedule, and you should know that going in." 1 year later, the Noah Caverly Veterans Recovery Center opened its doors to its first cohort of patients. The building was the same modest structure that had always stood on that corner lot in Chula Vista, but its interior had been gutted and rebuilt. Its corridors widened, its waiting room filled with natural light from new windows, its therapy spaces fitted with the specialized equipment that trauma rehabilitation actually required. Outside, where the architectural rendering had projected a glass tower rising above the neighborhood, a small garden had been planted instead, with a bench and a bronze plaque that most visitors stopped to read. Eloise Darden walked those corridors every morning in scrubs, and a clinical badge that read Director of Operations, her prosthetic left hand no longer hidden inside a sleeve. Beside her walked Argos, now wearing a service vest that designated him a certified facility therapy dog, a qualification his years of combat training had made almost effortless to earn. They moved through the building together, the way people and dogs do when they have had enough time to learn the rhythm of each other, the particular pace that belongs only to them. Two creatures who had each arrived at a long, dark stopping point and discovered, in the most unlikely architecture of a busy airport on a cold October morning, that the road had not actually ended. The last thing Eloise did every evening before she locked the center was stand in the doorway and look back at the intake room, at the wall above the reception desk where a framed photograph hung, a young man in combat uniform, kneeling in foreign dust, laughing, his arm around a dog who was already nearly as large as he was. She always said goodnight to both of them. And Argos, sitting at her heel, always looked up at the photograph for a moment, patient, still certain, before turning with her toward the door and whatever morning was coming next.